Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. Ukrainian boots are on Russian soil after a stunning counteroffensive that has humiliated President Vladimir Putin. It's the first time since the Second World War that Russia's borders have been breached. On this edition of the show, we'll consider the consequences for Russia, Ukraine and its Western allies.
The result of the American elections in the hands of Vladimir Putin. If Vladimir Putin agree with Americans to stop war in Ukraine, Kamala Harris will win the election.
The Russians have barricade forces behind their young troops, so if the troops turn around to run away, they get shot by their own people. And so the loss of life is huge.
One of the reasons why this Kursk offensive happened is to show that there are no such thing as red lines and to show that Ukrainian army has the capability to change the tide of the war. We just need not to have our hands tied behind our backs.
I don't think that Vladimir Putin and Pavel Durov met, because if such meeting happened, it could be very bad news for the Pavel Durov now in French prison.
At the weekend, Ukrainians around the world marked their country's third Independence Day since the Russian invasion. The mood was, for the most part, somber, defiant rather than celebratory. The Russian assault on Ukrainian independence continues to make progress in the Donbas region, where its superior numbers are closing in on the last city still within Ukrainian control. But for the first time since the war began, Ukrainian troops are on the ground in Russia, following an audacious incursion ordered by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The advance into the Kursk region took not only Russia by surprise, but also NATO leaders who were not informed of the plan. More than 100,000 Russian citizens were evacuated from towns in the path of the Ukrainian operation, and several voices have been raised expressing criticism of President Putin. It leaves us with a number of essential questions. Is this a key turning point in a war that's believed to have killed and injured more than 500,000 combatants? Will Ukraine use the ground it holds as a bargaining chip in a possible land swap? Could Western nations now permit Ukraine to use the weapons they supplied within Russian territory? And how will President Putin react to what's widely considered to be a humiliation for him and his country? We'll hear voices from both Russia and Ukraine. But first, let's consider the impact on the battlefield from a senior military expert who's been watching the situation closely. I'm joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a British military analyst who spent more than 30 years serving with the Royal Air Force. Sean Bell, great to have you on the show, sir.
Good to be here. Thanks, Riz.
Well, we're witnessing an extraordinary and unexpected phase in the Russia-Ukraine war, and you've been monitoring every development. So let's start with a quick recap of what's happened in the past couple of weeks.
Well, I think the big news is the Ukrainian incursion into Russia. By way of context, the incursion started small. It was probably just 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers, 20 tanks that did appear to include the Western battle tanks. But it did appear that Ukraine managed to move across the border relatively swiftly and have actually probably now got 10,000 troops in Russia. Now, whilst it's a relatively modest incursion, strategically it's vital. This is the first time that a foreign nation has actually invaded Russia since 1941. President Putin paints himself as Mr. Security, and therefore now, even though Putin controls the narrative within Russia itself, it's very difficult to stifle the 150 to 200,000 Russians who've had to be evacuated from the area, who will all be talking about the fact that Ukraine is now a threat on Russian soil. Quite how this plays out, we can certainly talk through, but it does seem to be quite an audacious move that the West didn't seem to anticipate, and it certainly appears Russia wasn't ready for it.
Well, exactly. So Ukraine's military push, as you say, took Russia by surprise, but also the Ukraine's Western allies. At what point did they learn about what was happening?
Well, what's fascinating about the Russian reaction, I think we can sort of learn a lot about how the West conducts these sort of wars and how Russia does. In our military, we delegate responsibility down to the lowest levels. So our junior ranks, our junior NCOs, the corporals, the sergeants, they understand commander's intent, and then they get on and act on the battlefield accordingly. In Russia, they don't have that delegation. It's always upwards delegated. So when there's a surprise like this, when Ukrainian forces come across the border, everybody looks to their bosses to see what they want to do, and the bosses look up to their bosses. And it goes all the way up to President Putin. And of course, that takes a long time. So you end up with this sort of strategic paralysis as a result of these incursions. And I suspect that's why it's taken so long for Russia to decide what it wants to do. Meanwhile, it looks like the border of Russia was fairly scantily protected, a few conscripts, and that was it. So you put some battle-hardened Ukrainian forces against them, they will roll back pretty quickly, and it appears that Ukraine has just capitalized on this. What we have to wait and see now is that now that Putin does understand what's happened, now he's got to decide how he wants to react. And it looks like he's really got two choices, one of which is to extinguish that incursion, go in there hard. But the only way he can do that is to move forces from the front line, probably the Donbas, to do that, and that would relieve pressure on the Ukrainians, which is probably what this was designed to do. Or Putin could leave that enclave for now. He knows that Ukraine has already said it has no intention of holding ground. Ukraine has blown a few bridges to make it difficult for Russia to push them out, but that also means Ukraine can't really expand. And in a way, Putin can just literally carry on focusing on the Donbas region, knowing full well that actually the Ukrainians have managed to probably 10,000 of their best troops well away from the front line. That could make life easier for Russia in the coming weeks.
I'll touch on some of that in just a moment, but it's interesting what you say about the chain of command, and it makes me ask, how tight was the circle of trust? You know, who was aware of the plan, do you think?
What's fascinating is that the West provides a lot of military support to Ukraine, not only in the weapons that we see very in high profile with large sums of money coming particularly from the US and the EU, but there's also a lot of intelligence that is provided to Ukraine, not only satellite intelligence, but also to the western border of Ukraine. It's bristling with air assets, so the eyes and the ears that can provide unique and fascinating and vital insight to Ukraine to inform the battle. Now, it's undoubtedly that intelligence would have helped guide Ukraine as to know where the weak spot was, what potentially Russia could do in response. But the real question is whether or not the West was actually asked. And I have to say, as a military guy, sometimes it's better to seek forgiveness than to ask permission. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that Ukraine wanted to act autonomously, but secrecy is so vital in these sorts of operations. And it does appear that Ukraine has very effectively conducted a secret operation, which has liberated tremendous results.
Why do you think Russia was so unprepared for such an attack, it seems?
Well, I think complacency is always interesting. How do you protect your own borders? I'm speaking to you from the United Kingdom. We have water around our borders, so we tend to take it for granted that we have a degree of security, whereas Russia has an over 1,200-mile border with Ukraine, and it's quite difficult to defend it, but it probably thought that there was no way that Ukraine would have the audacity to move in. Therefore, it probably had relatively rudimentary defenses. If we put this bluntly, if Russia was to protect its border effectively, it would probably need a few troops every feet along the way. And you quickly, when you do the maths, it quickly end up with several 100,000 soldiers on the front line. Well, it doesn't have those.
And yet, the Ukrainian military would have had to have considered some risks. What risks do you think they would have put ahead, of taking on this military incursion?
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word risk there, is because I've heard several people talk about a gamble. I mean, you go to Vegas for gambling. These military operations are normally very well planned. You look at what the risks are, how you might mitigate those risks, and what's the worst case, and how would you mitigate that. There's no doubt at all in my mind that one of the things that Ukraine would need to have found was a soft spot in the defences, and that's probably why they probably only started with about 1,000 troops, just really to embarrass President Putin. But when they managed to roll in so easily, then all of a sudden their plan B, their plan C, their contingency plans for if we do roll in unopposed, That seems to be what they've done. The challenge then is to go, how far do you go in? Those who are supportive of this move would say just keep going. But the logistics tail becomes more and more difficult to sustain. You've got to get fuel, weapons, all of the supplies further and further into Russia. And of course, that means you're more and more vulnerable to having your access routes cut off. And then all of a sudden, you're incredibly vulnerable to be snuffed out. So I think all of those ingredients are in the mix. And at the moment, it appears that's why Ukraine blew those bridges on the Seam River as a sort of furthest extent of their incursion, make it difficult for Russia to push them out, be a thorn in the side of President Putin, and then wait and see how he reacts.
Well, of course, on that point, it seems unlikely that President Putin would tolerate such an apparent humiliation. So how do you think he would take his revenge? And, you know, you've said he probably wouldn't go with the nuclear option, but is that something still in his deck of cards?
Well, I think, first of all, that nuclear saber rattling, President Putin's been doing that since the start of the war. Why has he been doing that? Well, he would know that if NATO or the West was to get directly involved in this war, Russia's progress would be stopped in a heartbeat. And therefore, he needed to do everything to scare the West not to get directly involved. You'll remember is that at the start of this campaign, we were reluctant to send any weapons into Ukraine because we thought there was a chance that Ukraine would be snuffed out after the initial attack. But Ukrainians fought with great bravery and courage. And since then, we've provided anti-tank weapons. Then we managed to step up and provide tanks. Then we were talking about long-range missiles. And now the F-16 has arrived. So I do think that gradual stepping up of Western support reflects the confidence that people have in Ukraine's ability to fight. The real question then is victory possible? And I have to say, as a military analyst, it's very difficult to know what that looks like.
It's interesting because President Zelensky claims that Russia's limited response so far indicates that his threat about red lines and reprisals if NATO weapons are used in Russia have perhaps been a bluff. And some Western countries have already given their blessing to using those weapons in the operation, while others are still reluctant. How's that debate progressing? What's at stake?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because for quite some time, the West has been operating somewhat autonomously. In other words, the Brits were happy to provide tanks, then other nations stepped in, and it almost sounded like it was up to individual nations. And certainly the Brits have been relatively happy to say, once we've given you weapons, Ukraine, as long as you use them in accordance with the law of armed conflict, then we're happy you use them wherever you use them. I think after this surprise incursion, suddenly President Zelensky was talking about using Western weapons from his forces on Russian soil against Russian targets. And I believe that behind the scenes, America said, look, I think given the threats, this is a Western activity, NATO, we're all part of the same organization. We've got to be careful to manage the risk here. So whilst we're not telling anybody to stop doing that, can we have a degree of alignment and coherence and agreement over what we are prepared to do and what we're not prepared to do? And as a result of that, I understand that the Americans, the Brits, the French, and a couple of others have agreed that they should have a coherent approach to these long-range weapons. And as a result, things like Storm Shadow from the West were limited in terms of how they could be used. But my understanding is the rest of the weapons, there is as long as they're used in within the rules of the armed conflict, then the West remains content to them to be used as President Zelensky sees fit.
Well, as you touched on, in the meantime, Russian troops are continuing to advance in the Donbas, and Ukraine's evacuating towns in their path. And one theory is that President Putin wants to build these gains as far as possible before turning attention to driving the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. Is that a credible idea?
Absolutely, Riz. I have to say that's, I think, the most credible idea. If you look at right at the start of the war, President Putin made his move on Kyiv. Remember that 40-mile corridor? And it looked likely Ukraine would fall very quickly. But because of Ukrainian resistance, their tenacity, their bravery, that approach failed. And Putin seemed to revise his strategy to a special military operation. And he's referred to that consistently over the last 2.5 years. And it looks likely the aims of that are to secure Crimea, to secure the Donbas, and the land bridge between the two. And if you look at that on a map, there's a whole swathes of red as to where Russia has occupied now. The only bit it hasn't occupied of that plan is that small section of the Donbas that includes the towns of Pokrovsk and Terezk. And that seems to be where he's putting most of his effort. It also won't be lost that in the winter, and we're talking about sort of post-November, fighting becomes a lot more difficult in Ukraine. It's very cold, very wet, it freezes over. It doesn't mean fighting stops, but it does mean that between now and then, Putin's got between 10 and 12 weeks, really, to make as many gains as he can do. And one of the things he's probably gambling on is if President Trump wins the race to the White House, Trump has been very clear that there's a deal to be done and he wants to end the war. And President Putin will probably want to put himself in the best negotiating position possible by November to enable him to potentially agree to some sort of negotiated settlement. Problem is with that is that that effectively rewards Putin for his brutal invasion of Ukraine. And that, of course, would have profound implications for global security.
Well, it has been suggested that the Russian advances are coming at a terrible human cost in terms of troops killed. At what point do you think the scale of losses filter back to the Russian people and have an impact on President Putin's ability to order a new round of troop mobilization?
Yeah, it's a really topical question, Riz. I mean, I keep a track of some of the Ministry of Defense data that comes out, and at one stage, the Russian casualties were over 1,600 a day. Now, put into context, the battle for Bakhmut, which was that bloody battle, it was highlighted as the single bloodiest battle since the Second World War. At the height of that, the Russians were taking about 900 casualties a day. So they've been taking a hell of a lot of casualties in their push. I spoke to a couple of Ukrainians who said it's just heartbreaking because they are just being forced over the front. The Russians have barricade forces behind their young troops. So if the troops turn around to run away, they get shot by their own people. And so the loss of life is huge, but it is grinding away slow progress. And it looks likely that Putin does not want to do another round of mobilization for the very reasons you articulate, that will be very, very difficult for the Russian people to stomach. What Putin has been doing is trying to recruit mercenaries from around the world with very attractive bounties and salaries. Initially, that was a very high take-up rate, but of course, they have suffered tremendous casualties because they've been pushed straight to the front line, and therefore the number of people attracted by that has apparently plummeted. So Russia is now getting in fewer than 1,000 people a day. It's losing more than that. Therefore, it is struggling. But to be brutally honest, both Ukraine and Russia almost certainly don't have the people, the troops, or the equipment to achieve a strategic breakthrough. What Russia's simply trying to do is get as far as it can by winter, and potentially leaves a few options open.
Well, you'd mentioned the problems Russia's had with its manpower, so to speak, for the troops. On the other side, there have been reports of Ukrainian resistance weakening due to poor training of recent recruits, some of whom had tried to avoid conscription. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, we're certainly hearing a bit of that. I think, as ever in wartime, I was a student of the Second World War. You know, you've got lots of people who wanted to fight to protect the country, but you've also got a lot of people who did not. And inevitably, as this war grinds on, the Ukraine, a smaller nation, has a smaller population, inevitably needs to have constant rounds of mobilization, and that's not always possible. The other challenge, of course, is if you have to at short notice bring people in, you can't necessarily give them the training they need before they get thrown into battle. And having seen firsthand, you know, until you've been shot at, your own reaction to that, the sounds of battle, the views, your colleagues being killed on the battlefield, it's quite a shock to the system. And that's why battle-hardened troops are invaluable. But new recruits, it's very difficult to throw them straight into the front line.
I wonder, in such circumstances, how can Ukraine afford to take thousands of its most battle-hardened soldiers, as we discussed, out of the front line to take part in the cross-border raid in Kursk?
I think that's a really good question to hold for the time when we know whether this risky strategy by Ukraine has paid off or not. One of the things about the military is that, particularly this particular battle, is that Ukraine is a significantly smaller military, smaller nation, smaller in all aspects of the military side. So if it was simply to enter a grinding war of attrition against Russia, it would lose. I mean, remember back in the sort of days where people just met on a field at dawn and fought each other to the death. The bigger, stronger army would prevail. Ukraine has to avoid that sort of battle. Otherwise, it is destined to fail. So it has to be more innovative. It has to take risks. It has to try to surprise the enemy. It has to deceive them. And I think this latest move into Kursk is a great example of that. It has great risks carried with it, but it also has the potential to swing the balance in Ukraine's favor. And it's too early at the moment to make that judgment.
How much do ordinary Russian people know about what happened, and how have they responded to the idea of having Ukrainian troops on their territory?
Well, that is a fascinating question, Riz. I've been trying to get that under the skin of that. When you control the media, when you control the information space, day to day, my understanding is that Russians just keep their heads down as long as it doesn't affect their individual lives. They believe what they've been fed, which is that Russia is liberating Ukraine. The challenge, of course, is that the number of injured service men and women, largely men, returning to Russia is huge. That is not something that you can easily hide. And I think that's something that over time is almost certainly gradually eroding Putin's support base. But it's worth remembering that Putin doesn't stay in power just because he's elected. He really keeps in power because the oligarchs and the power base below him, if that power base believes Putin's gone too far, that actually, I mean, let's face it, he's indicted by the International Criminal Court. There's all sorts of sanctions around. Wealthy Russians can no longer enjoy the lives they once did around in the West. It's quite possible, as this pressure mounts, that there's a short, sharp correction in Russia and in an effort to try to get onto a more stable footing.
Well, we've seen some reports of criticism emerging from a few military bloggers, but also from the leader of a militia group who's called for President Putin to be overthrown. Some people are calling him the new Prigozhin, after the leader of the Wagner group who had led a mutiny and then was subsequently killed when his plane mysteriously fell out of the sky. How dangerous is such descent to President Putin's grip on power? And how much of a risk are those dissidents taking themselves, do you think?
They're taking a huge risk themselves, and it's very difficult to see how a dissident group is going to be able to mount an effective operation against President Putin. President Putin shrouds himself in security, and unlike in the West, where we have to generate money through and revenues through hard work, Putin has huge oil and gas resources which fund a lot of his war efforts, and he's managed to triple the size of his defense industrial base, largely funded by oil revenue. So he's got a lot of resources available to him to protect himself, and he will be pretty certain to, he knows that's a strategic risk, and therefore will make sure he's mitigated that. I think more of an issue is if his power base around him, those close to him, think that actually this has gone too far, that the initial foray of maybe within a matter of days, maybe weeks, that actually Russia could reclaim, in their own words, Ukraine, rebuild the former Soviet Union. But actually, we're now 920 odd days later. It's still a grinding war. It doesn't look like Russia's going to be able to subjugate Ukraine anytime soon. Russia was trying to stop the expansion of NATO. NATO has expanded even further as a direct result. Russia wants to make Russia great again. It's a pariah on the world stage. And of course, Putin himself is indicted. There might well be some of his power base that are scratching their heads and going, how's this all going to end? How do we return to the lives we had before? And what part could they play in that?
Well, Sean Bell, thank you so much for your analysis of the situation. I'm sure we're going to have a chance to chat again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Riz.
So how have the latest developments been viewed by the people in Ukraine? After 3 years of battling for their country's survival, the frontline soldiers are exhausted and the civilian population is weary of war. So could images of Ukrainian troops taking the war to Russia inspire the nation? Well, I'm joined now by Ukrainian journalist Svetlana Morenets, who's a staff writer with The Spectator and recently won the Young Journalist of the Year award at the Press Awards. Svetlana, thank you for your time. Let me start by asking how Independence Day was marked by Ukrainians around the world.
Of course, Ukrainians celebrated this day with such a pride, but also feeling big sorrow because of the sacrifice that Ukrainian still making for its independence, and they are still fighting for it. And I want to stress that today, just now, Russia launched a massive missile and drone strike against Ukraine. And before, we were expected that it would happen on the Independence Day, but it happened today, and over 100 missiles and 100 drones were launched against Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian targets too. And the Iranian government that congratulated Ukraine on its Independence Day last Saturday, uh, right now, their drones are bombing Ukraine on daily basis, and Ukrainians were quite appalled by their congratulation and by that move. And at the moment, um, there are severe blackouts in the country. And you know that festive mood that was on Saturday, it is of course gone by now. And the whole summer Ukrainians spent mostly without electricity, with some families having only 2 hours of electricity per day. And as soon as Ukraine could repair its power stations, today Russia launched the attack again.
So let me ask you, Svetlana, because you know the dynamic has changed in this war right now. You visited the country before the Ukrainian army crossed the border into Russia, and I'm wondering, how did the mood prior to that compare with what you've been hearing from people since? How have they reacted to the fact that Ukraine's now pushed into Russia?
Look, at the beginning, I was at the Ukrainian front line several weeks before Ukraine launched an incursion into the Kursk region, and the mood was quite depressing because for over a year, Ukrainian army was in defense with Russian troops very slowly but still advancing, especially in the east of the country. There were not enough soldiers in the army, not enough weapons to fight with. Ukrainian civilians were also tired because of the blackouts and because a lot of their loved ones died in the war. So the incursion into Russia was quite a big mood booster among the soldiers and also among civilians. They finally could feel that Ukraine actually could do something, that there was still a chance to change the tide, to
Right.
change the tide in the war.
Now, I know, Svetlana, that you, as a writer, as a journalist, you travel regularly to Ukraine, and you are trying very much to keep the pulse of the Ukrainian people, you know, for the world audience. Are Ukrainians comfortable with the idea of having their troops pushing forward onto Russian soil, or are there concerns about that?
I would say they are quite comfortable with that because Russia receives what it brought to Ukraine. But I want to stress that Ukraine doesn't need Russian lands or Russian people, and doesn't plan to annex them, anything like that. It's just the only way for Ukraine to fight this war right now is to bring it back to Russian soil, because on the front line in Ukraine currently, there is no way with the current amount of weapons that Ukrainian troops can breach the Russian side of the front line.
Well, of course, that incursion into Kursk was an unprecedented move and a surprise to both the Russians and Ukraine's allies. So what does that say about the relationship and the level of trust between President Zelensky and NATO countries now?
The problem is that Ukraine is facing constant restrictions from its allies, and there is an expression that better to say sorry later than to ask for a permission, because Ukraine constantly is met with the red lines, and we are not allowed to use American weapons and, for example, British Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russian airfields and military bases inside of Russia. For Zelensky, it was a choice to do it without a permission, and to see, as Ukraine succeeded, allies now support this move. At the beginning, they were like frustrated and thinking how it is gonna turn out. And now watching the Putin's reaction, that there is almost no reaction. He is more busy capturing Donetsk region in Ukraine than protecting his citizens in the Kursk region. So now, of course, allies support this move. We will see how far it goes. Hopefully, Ukrainian troops can hold the ground in the Kursk region long enough.
Now, there have been reports during the conflict of Russian young men and men trying to flee the idea of having to be forced to fight. Now there are reports of Ukrainian men fleeing the country to dodge conscription, of new recruits fleeing their positions rather than facing the enemy. What do people feel about that? What's being done to counter it?
Look, throughout 2 years of full-scale war, of course, there were men who are fleeing the country and they hide in the trucks and pay bribes to leave the country. But it's small percentage if to compare it with the amount of men who joined the fight at the beginning voluntarily and now who they conscripted. Of course, before the Kursk offensive, there was a problem with the soldiers voluntarily leaving their positions, what you call desertion. And Ukrainian government tries to manage that by saying they made a law that if soldiers leave the position once and they return later, they're not going to be punished and not going to be imprisoned. I don't know if it is a right strategy because more soldiers will be leaving their position and endangering other troops and Ukrainian defensive lines. I would add that there is a big problem with conscription right now. It's very hard to convince men after 2 years of full-scale war why they should go and risk their lives, especially when they know they won't have enough weapons. It's crucial. They know they won't have enough weapons to fight with.
Yes. Well, another sign that attitudes might be changing is the number of Ukrainians who are reportedly supportive of peace negotiations with Russia. And I wonder, does that mean that they're ready to concede some of the land the Russians now have occupied?
Look, the last poll showed that like over 50% of Ukrainians wanted peace negotiations with Russia, but at the same time, all of them were against ceding territory. So you see that people, of course, they are tired of war and they seek peace, but at the same time, they are not ready to appease the aggressor and give Russia what it wants.
Well, the World Heritage Body UNESCO has stated that Russia seems to be deliberately targeting Ukrainian historical and cultural sites as a way to weaken that identity. Now, how concerned are Ukrainians about Russian promises they'll wipe out Ukrainian culture in the land they've occupied?
Look, in the occupied lands that Russia holds, there are no more Ukrainian churches, no more Ukrainian museums, anything left of Ukraine, no more Ukrainian language. That's why Ukrainians are so keen to fight for the lands that still Russia couldn't capture. And throughout Ukraine, through the country, Russia targets historical sites with the missiles and drones too. But thanks to our allies, we now have more air defense systems and we are more able to protect these sites. I would say Ukraine right now is stronger than ever, and Ukrainian culture and language is stronger than ever, because if at the beginning, since we got our independence, there was much of Russian influence in the country and we had Russian speaking TV, books in Russian, you know, like we were becoming like Belarus, where its language is almost extinct. Only 3% of Belarusian people speak Belarusian. But because of the war that Russia brought to Ukraine, I think Ukrainians finally realized their identity and the need to be independent.
Yes, I heard some reports to that effect. Now, during the first months of the conflict, we saw reports of families existing in bomb shelters with water, food, and electricity running out. What is life like now for Ukrainians, and how different is the experience in different parts of the country?
I can give you example of my own family. I have a little brother who is 9 years old, and the first year of the full-scale war, he almost didn't go to school, and if he went, most of the time he spent in the bomb shelter. You even can't call it a bomb shelter. Most of the schools don't have them. It's a basement. So if a missile hits it directly, everyone will be dead. But if it explodes nearby, children will survive. So it was quite awful. But right now, there are less air raid alarms and also stronger air defense systems. And supposedly this year, children will have more opportunity to spend time in schools. And also for families, when you have air alert going on for 24 hours non-stop, but you have to go to work, you have to bring children to schools, to kindergartens, you have to keep living. So a lot of people, they just decide not to go to the bomb shelter anymore. Of course, those living closer to the front line take it more seriously, but for example, in Kyiv, you can rarely see people going to the bomb shelters.
Well, with the conflict ongoing, have party politics been set aside in the country, or are there differences resurfacing between political rivals such as President Zelensky and the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko?
There has always been a rivalry between Zelensky and Klitschko since Zelensky came to the office, and but when Putin invaded in 2022, all the rivalries were set aside, and all the parties and opposition in Ukrainian parliament were working together. Right now, I would say there is sometimes, from time to time, Klitschko says something acute towards Zelensky, but he has been heavily criticized for it from people because right now it is not the time for the political rivalry in the country. And Ukraine can't have elections because our constitution forbids it during martial law. So when politicians try to gain some political points right now, they only make worse it for themselves. That's why even if some try to gain some votes for the future elections, it goes badly for them, and they try to stay silent at the moment.
During our conversations, Svetlana, you've indicated a couple of times how Ukrainians feel about not necessarily having the tools to do the job they need to militarily. And I'm wondering, do Ukrainians feel let down by the West as they put limits on the use of weapons and perhaps turn their attention from Ukraine to Gaza in recent months?
For Ukraine, it would be much easier not to shut down the missiles flying over the country, but to shut down the planes from which these missiles are being launched. And Ukraine has proved to be a reliable ally, and they never never used Western weapons when there were restrictions, and they used it appropriately as allies asked. So the allies can be sure that Ukraine won't be using British Storm Shadow missiles to shell Russian kindergartens, because Kyiv doesn't do that. They will be used to strike military sites. And one of the reasons why this Kursk offensive happened is to show that there are no such thing as red lines, and to show that Ukrainian army has the capability to change the tide of the war. We just need not to have our hands tied behind our backs.
Well, regarding the weapons situation, on the positive side, it seems Ukraine has proved to be very resourceful in developing its own drone production industry, and that's helping to fight Russian troops in Kursk and elsewhere. What do you know about that side of the war effort?
The Western restrictions that Ukraine had, it was what pushed Ukraine to develop its own weapons. And Ukraine now has over 100 drone manufacturers at home who have contracts with the defense ministry. And this year, Ukraine plans to produce 1 million drones, and they are used to strike Russia in Kursk region, and also in further regions of Russia. They are oil stations and airfields, and it was very, very effective. And on Independence Day, Zelensky announced that Ukraine developed a new drone kind of missile called Palyanytsia, and they used it to strike one Russian military base. It was quite successful. So I'm glad that Ukraine is developing its own weapons, because in the end, Ukrainians can rely only on themselves, and to be safe and to be protected and to be able to fight back Russia, we need our own weapons industry. And also Ukraine is signing contracts with the weapons manufacturers in Europe and opening the plants in Europe, joint plants, for example, for artillery shells, which later be supplied to Ukraine.
Svetlana, on another subject, President Zelensky recently passed a law banning the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine after claims that the clergy were spying for Russia. And that's being framed by some American politicians as preventing Christians from following their religion. How dangerous is such a perception?
To be honest, I was quite struck that Ukrainian government did it before the American elections, because Russian propaganda is quite strong in saying that Ukraine is persecuting Christians, and Trump's running mate JD Vance is quite keen on talking about that all the time. But of course, it is not true. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russian churches in Ukraine were used for propaganda, for spying. And in Lavra, Kiev-Pечersk Lavra, the oldest monastery in Ukraine, when the investigators made the searching of the building, they found the Russian passports of the priests, the Russian flags, the Soviet books, the bags of cash full of rubles and dollars. And of course, it's a problem, because the difference between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, that is, one is ruled from the Kremlin and one is ruled from the Kiev. And the one that is ruled from the Kremlin, Patriarch Kirill leads it, who is a very keen supporter of the invasion of Ukraine. So in order to defend Ukrainian security and Ukrainian freedom, it was done. And I want to stress that the law doesn't ban immediately Russian Church. They have 9 months to switch to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and they can continue saying prayers in Russian if they want. They can stay in the same building, do what they did, but be under Kiev's authority. At least 15% already made that. We will see how it goes further.
I was going to say that might create some divisions in society anyway. But speaking of America, were Ukrainians heartened by the resurgence of the Democratic Party under Kamala Harris and the possibility that she could defeat Donald Trump?
To be honest, it is like a relief for now, because of course the prospect of Trump coming back to power is very dangerous for Ukraine. But also we are not sure yet what Kamala's policies will be regarding Ukraine. She said that she will not leave Ukraine alone. But we have a problem when America says we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. This sentence means that there is no actual strategy how they see Ukrainian victory, or how they see this war ending. There is no strategy, and as long as it doesn't work. So there is hope. If Kamala Harris wins, there is actually be a plan presented and agreed and negotiated about how this war can finish.
Well, of course, we'll keep an eye on everything that's happening there. Svetlana Moronets, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin is a student of Russian history and admirer of the Tsar Peter the Great. He values strength and security and has been building a legacy with those principles at its core. But now that legacy must include presiding over the first breach of Russian borders since the Second World War. Voices critical of the president are rare in Russia, but several have emerged among military bloggers and notably the leader of a Russian militia who's called for the president to be overthrown. Few expect President Putin to let such humiliation go unanswered. So how will he deal with the Kursk incursion? My next guest knows him well. Sergei Markov is a professor of international relations at Moscow University and is a close confidant of President Putin. Sergei Markov, thank you very much for joining us again. Now, you've described Ukraine's incursion into Russian territory as a humiliation for Russia and President Putin. As someone who knows him well, how does President Putin react to such humiliation? Is he angry? Is he shouting at generals? Is he kicking, throwing things around? Or is he quietly kind of plotting his revenge through military strategy?
A few things. First of all, I think it's more offending than humiliation. Because, first of all, Vladimir Putin understands that it's part of the reality. The war is a war, and sometimes the enemies can have success. Also, majority of the people in Russia, you should understand how Russian people react. It's for Western countries. There are big difference between Kursk region and Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. For us, for Russia, there are no difference. Both of them, all of them, juridically, Kursk region, Donetsk, Lugansk, also part of the Russia. And also, if you compare the real damage to Russia, either to take control of the a couple of dozens of villages in the deep rural area in Kursk region, or they sharing Donetsk and Lugansk, big city. Donetsk with more than million, Mariupol half of the million. And a lot of people in Russia visited many times Donetsk and Mariupol and so on. And for us, it's tragedy. And look, Ukrainian government army still control Odessa and Kharkov. This is brilliant Russian cities for the most of the Russians. So it means that this is some crossing of red line for Western countries, but not for the Russians.
Now, of course, both sides are seeing the issue of having to spread their troops quite thinly across the ground. But given the continuing casualties suffered by Russian forces in the Donbas and increasing numbers of families receiving news that their sons have been killed or injured, is another round of mobilization something that you think would be acceptable or unacceptable to the Russian people?
I think if a new wave of mobilization will happen, it will be accepted by most of the Russian people. But of course, they will be absolutely not happy about this. But they trust to Vladimir Putin very much, and popularity of Vladimir Putin something between 80 and 90%.
Well, perception, of course, Dr. Markov, is very important. With more than 100,000 Russian citizens evacuated, how difficult is it to control the message when real Russian lives are being affected and people, of course, talk to their families across the country? The message gets out.
I think most of the people in Russia, they look at this situation as a tragedy. And at the same time, they understand that this war not against Ukrainians. Ukrainians is regarded by Russian people some kind of as slaves without consciousness and mind. And we regard this war as war against America. United States of America, with great allies of NATO, is the biggest military coalition in the human history. So this war, not easy war. That's why this invasion to the Kursk region is regarded as very bad thing, tragedy, but quite realistic and thing which could happen during the war.
Now, understandably, you're consistently supportive of the government line. You're close to Vladimir Putin, Dr. Markov. But on a personal basis, how worried are Russians that they see this war coming to their towns and villages? I mean, what do you hear people saying about it?
People saying that it was very bad job of the Russian Defense Ministry first, and of course the number of the military zones Kursk region should be much more bigger than it appeared to be. Also, people think that if it was a secret agreement between Russia and the United States that Ukrainian army wouldn't attack traditional Russian territories, I think it was, people think that it was a mistake of the Russian authorities, because it's crazy to trust to the Americans. They're lying every time. And thirdly, and people think that it's a duty to help people from Kursk region. I have my own friends who live in Kursk region. Luckily, they live not on the western part, but on the eastern part of the Kursk region, so they are not in trouble situation. But people now try to help their own friends who appear to be in difficult situation. Same time, nobody see that this Ukrainian attack should be a reason to stop operation. But most of the people say that if Ukraine are increasing such attack, it means that Russia should increase crashing of Ukrainian army and liberation of Ukrainian people from pro-American puppet regime. It's a general opinion. The opinion could be changed if Ukrainian rocket missiles will have explosion in the Moscow, St. Petersburg, and another Milan city, or if capital of the Kursk region, Kursk, or Kursk atomic power station would be taken by Ukrainian army. This could lead to the change of public opinion, but probably to change not in the direction of capitulation, but to direction of the using tactical nuclear weaponry.
Well, President Zelensky of Ukraine also claimed the operation that his military conducted has proved that President Putin's warnings of reprisals about using NATO-supplied weapons on Russian soil were empty threats. How do you regard that view?
We are in Russia absolutely sure that Americans will allow Ukrainian army to use long-distance rocket missiles to attack big Russian cities. I personally think, as an expert, that Joe Biden will make this decision before he finishes his presidency. Probably he will not do it before the presidential elections because he understands that such kind of escalation can undermine opportunity of Kamala Harris to be elected as the president. But probably after the elections, President Biden will make the decision to give to the Ukrainian army long-distance rocket missiles for attacking of Russian big cities, including such cities as Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Now, you said, Dr. Markov, if that happens, that pushes President Putin towards tactical nuclear weapons. When the Russian president warns he's prepared to use nuclear weapons if the West doesn't abide by his rules of war, how does the average person on the street in Moscow or St. Petersburg feel? I mean, do they applaud or are they terrified by the prospect?
Of course, people very much terrified by the prospect of using tactical nuclear weaponry because they understand that's a very big escalation. And most of the people, frankly speaking, even don't want to think about such escalations because it's too dangerous. People on mass consciousness level, people try to avoid such kind of discussion. But of course, the Russian elite has intensive discussion about conditions under which Russian tactical nuclear weaponry can be used. Some of the people say that it could happen if it will be attacking of the intensive, constant attacking of the Moscow. Some of the people think that it will happen. It could happen if F-16 aviation will be used by, in fact, NATO from the airfield from Romania and Poland.
Well, you know, irrespective of what President Putin says, in your opinion, what are the circumstances, if any, that could justify a nuclear war?
From my opinion, tactical nuclear weaponry can be used if it will be not so much success of the Ukrainian army. No, such as the tactical nuclear weapon can be used if will be some high level of the involvement of the NATO country to the Ukrainian war. So tactical nuclear weaponry will be used not to stop Ukrainian army, but to stop NATO armies.
Now, going back to the current situation with the Ukrainian incursion onto Russian soil, one theory is that President Putin wants to press home Russian advances in the east, particularly in the Donbas region, before winter arrives, after which he can turn his attention to the Kursk region. Now, does that sound like a sensible strategy, or in spite of what you say about it being only a tiny kind of incursion from Russian perspective, would it be too much to ask the Russian people to tolerate Ukrainian soldiers on their land for much longer?
I think the reaction of Russian people will be not positive, but nevertheless, most of the people will understand. Now it's clear that Russian strategy is to have offensive on the Donbas region. First of all, to go to the Pokrovsk city, which is an important center of the Ukrainian defense line. If during those time the Russian army will get victories in Donbas, people will accept it. And for the most of the Russian people, not Kursk more important than Donbas, but Donbas more important than Kursk.
But considering how far things have gone now, Dr. Markov, especially with Ukrainian troops on Russian soil now, is a negotiated settlement to the conflict even remotely possible?
I think that negotiation could happen as a result of the American presidential elections. Maybe because in my past I worked for the American Democratic Party during 15 years. And I have experience of dealing with Americans. I believe that election committee of Kamala Harris, wants to have a peace break on the period of elections. Because according to sociology in the United States, 83% of the voters believe that there are real threats, that hybrid war between America and Russia on the Ukrainian soil can move to the direct nuclear war between them, and most of the American people can be killed. That's why Kamala Harris has a lot of problems to be elected if this Ukrainian war continues and escalates. So it will be some kind of suggestion from American side during, I think, the October, with very, very big steps towards Russia for making a peace break. It means that the result of the American elections in the hands of Vladimir Putin. If Vladimir Putin agrees with Americans to stop war in Ukraine, Kamala Harris will win the election. If Vladimir Putin not agree to stop the war and this war will continue, Donald Trump will win the elections.
Well, let's look east, Dr. Markov. Now, we saw images of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi with his arm around the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during a visit to Kiev at the weekend. Now, is he playing both sides, or is he curbing his enthusiasm following recent criticism of his visit to Moscow?
I think Modi tried to stress that India is a neutral country. A lot of people have been very much impressed by the fact that Prime Minister Modi first visited Moscow after he had been re-elected. And it can send the signal that India now ally of Russia. But it's not what Modi wants to show. India is friend of Russia, but not ally of Russia, because India is neutral country. That's why for balancing first visit after election to Moscow, Modi visited Kiev.
Now, you'd indicated your perspective on how much public support there is in Russia for President Putin, but there's been some criticism coming from military bloggers. And Georgy Zakrevsky, a leader of a private militia called Paladin, has called for President Putin to be overthrown. Now, Western media, of course, are portraying him as the next Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner group leader whose aeroplane exploded soon after he led a revolt against Moscow. How significant are these recent criticisms, in your opinion?
The criticism of Vladimir Putin very low. People understand that even those who disagree with Vladimir Putin, for example, on economic policy, communists disagree with Putin on economic policy. And some of the pro-liberal forces also disagree with Vladimir Putin about geopolitics and so on. But nevertheless, most of the people are seeing that during the war, the nation should be consolidated. And Yevgeny Prigozhin case also shows very well. You know, I knew Yevgeny Prigozhin personally, and I knew that in past Yevgeny Prigozhin was very close friend to Vladimir Putin. And sometimes he made a very big mistake. Majority of the people very much supported Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner Group. Very much. He had tremendous 90% support among Russian population, but only until moment when he disagreed with chief commander, military chief commander of Russia. After he made this so-called march for justice to Moscow, immediately all his popular support had been disappeared. So it's good example for all other politicians. You can criticize Vladimir Putin's specific characteristic of politics in many areas. But to say something negatively about personally Vladimir Putin immediately make any politicians with almost zero support in Russia.
Well, it's been a year ago this week that Prigozhin was killed when his plane mysteriously fell from the sky. And I'm wondering how that investigation is actually going.
Investigations formally is going on, but in fact, nobody had nothing about those investigations. So it means that most of the people believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin have been neutralized by Russian authorities. But I also should say you that something about 20% of the Russian populations believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin alive, and he now fighting somewhere in African countries for Russian interests and doing this with change of the face after cosmetology operation and with another name.
How do you regard Georgy Zakrevsky of Paladin? What sort of voice, what significance of voice do you think he has?
Zero, absolutely. Zero. It's just, you know, one of the information provocation of the Americans.
What are your thoughts about the arrest in Paris of the Telegram founder and CEO Pavel Durov?
I think Pavel Durov is genius. And he is not pro-Russian very much. He is a libertarian. That's why he came to conflict with Russian authorities. And Pavel Durov created Telegram as now #1 network and now #1 opportunity for freedom. So Telegram and Durov is symbol of the freedom. Telegram and Durov, it's synonymous of the word freedom now. Because if you may know, after intensive political censorship in YouTube and Facebook, in fact, they not exist for the free people. This is only for Facebook and YouTube. Political segments used mostly for propaganda. And Telegram is freedom. So arrest of Telegram is attempt of the United States intelligence service community in coalition with French intelligence service to kill freedom in Telegram and to take control of such Telegram network.
In fact, I think Vyacheslav Volodin, the chairman of Russia's State Duma, lower house of parliament, has actually accused the US of being behind the arrest, and I think you seem to agree with what you've said. Now, does the Russian military use Telegram as a means of communication, and could that be a security risk if they were able to gain access, Western allies gained access to the platform?
Yes, first of all, I would say Vyacheslav Volodin and me will express the opinion which in Russia, I think, supported by 99% of the population, because nobody believes that France is an independent country. And most of the people believe that it's United States been initiated of the arrest of the Pavel Durov. Not, I think, maybe not 90% less, but majority of the people in the whole world also believe that as Americans, in fact, arrested Pavel Durov. So, if to take Telegram using by Russian military, this it's number one. In fact, information space for using, and because it's very easy, because it's secret, secretly enough. So it's now, as I know, a lot of Russian officials also get a recommendation to stop using of Telegram for the sensitive exchange of the messages. And as to Russian army, it can be still used because you should understand what it practically means. That there are thousands of soldiers and officers used for the thousands of the technical messages. This house in this village. This coordinates, this means, so it's very difficult for the NATO intelligence service to crash this. But in fact, this, of course, a signal that for the future, possibly Russian army will have to replace Telegram by something else. In fact, Russian army have enough messages, military messages for using, but they are not so well for using as Telegram. So if Telegram will be not impossible to use, Russian army will move to the own messages.
Now,
they already exist, and few of them exist, but maybe not so good.
from what you know, sir, is President Putin a supporter of Pavel Durov and his social media platform? And do you know, did they meet last week when they were both in Azerbaijan?
We have no specific information. I frankly speaking believe that Pavel Durov wanted to meet Vladimir Putin. That's why he came to Azerbaijan same time as Vladimir Putin had visit there. But same time, I don't think that Vladimir Putin and Pavel Durov met. To say more specifically, I think Russian authorities, even such meeting happened, never recognize now that such meeting really happened. First of all, because it has happened was top secret, and secondly, because if such meeting happened, it could be very bad news for the Pavel Durov now in French prison.
Now, is it fair to say, Dr. Markov, that President Putin wants to leave a legacy as one of the most significant Russian leaders in history? And if so, whatever happens now to his legacy, will it include being responsible for allowing the first invasion of Russian borders since World War II? How does it affect his reputation? I know you say he has such a huge following and support, but how do you think it will affect his legacy now?
Now Vladimir Putin has few legacies. First of all, and it's absolutely will be with him for sure, that Vladimir Putin stopped chaos and destroying of Russia. Secondly, Vladimir Putin stopped Chechnya war by winning this Chechnya war. Thirdly, Vladimir Putin made up conditions for the tremendous growth of the standard of living in Russia, and also a big part of reality. Fourth legacy is that Vladimir Putin changed pro-American regime which been in Russia before he come to power, to the independent great Russia. So it's already with him. Now, fifth legacy is that in his presidency, in the time of his presidency, the big war happened. And we don't know how many Russians have been killed, but absolutely clear that there are thousands and thousands of them. And also, Ukrainians regarded by Russians as Russians. Also, it means that Ukrainian Russian soldiers for us, it also Russian killed soldiers. So this is tragedy. It's another legacy which can crash previous positive legacy. On this comparison of the big real war, the problem with taking of Ukrainian army for the few weeks, probably a few villages on Kursk region, in fact, nothing.
All right. Well, Dr. Sergei Markov, thank you very much. Glad to have your perspective.
Yes, my pleasure.
The effects of the war will be felt at the Paralympic Games that opens in Paris this week. Following a ruling by the International Paralympic Committee, the Russian and Belarusian contingents have to compete within a neutral team. Their uniforms cannot display any national colours. Winners will hear only the Paralympic Games anthem, no national flags will be flown, and they cannot take part in the parade of athletes. And these athletes also have to sign a document of neutrality, agreeing not to support the war or having any connection with the Russian military. 90 Paralympic athletes from Russia will compete as neutrals against a team of 140 Ukrainians, including several veterans of the war with Russia. Well, Ukraine has been one of the most successful nations at the Paralympics, ranking third in Rio and second in Beijing in the medals tables. But this year, training has been disrupted by the war, with up to 500 training facilities destroyed, damaged, or under Russian occupation. And with so many children evacuated or living under Russian-controlled areas, Ukrainian sports officials fear that a whole generation of future athletes will be lost. That's all from our special coverage of the war in Ukraine and now Russia. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thank you for watching.